The moment I stepped through the ballroom doors, 200 Navy SEALs rose to their feet so fast, their chairs scraped against the marble floor like gunfire. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. A commander near the entrance straightened his posture and shouted with the kind of force that rattled crystal chandeliers. "Admiral on deck." And then came the silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that makes people suddenly aware of their own breathing. My mother's face drained of color. My younger sister Melanie stood frozen beside her wedding cake, one hand still wrapped around her bouquet. And my father, the same man who had texted me less than 24 hours earlier telling me nobody cared about my Navy career, looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. I wish I could tell you that moment felt good. For 30 years I'd imagined some version of it. Some moment where people who dismissed me would finally understand who I'd become. But standing there in my white dress uniform with 4 stars on my shoulders, all I really felt was tired. Tired enough to realize revenge rarely arrives the way you imagine it. The strange thing about humiliation is that it ages with you. I was 58 years old standing in a Charleston ballroom, yet part of me still felt like the skinny 17-year-old girl sitting at my parents' dinner table, while my father praised my little sister for being sweet and criticized me for being difficult. Back then, Melanie could do no wrong. She was homecoming queen. Church choir. Beautiful smile. Perfect manners. And me? I was the girl who asked too many questions. The girl who wanted to join ROTC. The girl who talked about aircraft carriers instead of weddings. My father used to laugh whenever I mentioned the military. "Claire," he'd say, "women don't belong on warships." That was in 1985. I remember because Ronald Reagan was still president, and my mother was cooking meatloaf when I announced I wanted to apply to the Naval Academy. Melanie nearly choked, laughing. My father folded his newspaper slowly and looked at me like I'd embarrassed him. "You'll grow out of this phase." But I didn't. If anything, the Navy became the one place where people finally stopped asking me to shrink myself. At Annapolis, nobody cared whether I smiled enough. Nobody cared whether I looked pretty at church socials. They cared whether I could lead, whether I could endure, whether I could stay calm when things got hard. Turns out I could, though my family never quite forgave me for it. Over the years, our phone calls became shorter. Birthdays forgotten. Holidays missed because I was deployed. My father once introduced me to a neighbor by saying, "This is our daughter Claire. She works for the government." Works for the government. At the time, I'd already commanded thousands of sailors. But I smiled politely because after a while disappointment becomes routine. 3 days before Melanie's wedding, I was sitting inside my office at Naval Station Norfolk reviewing retirement paperwork when my phone buzzed. "Dad." I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken properly in months. Instead, I opened the message. "No one cares about your Navy career. Please don't embarrass us by wearing that uniform to Melanie's wedding." I stared at the screen a long time. Outside my office window, gray Atlantic rain hammered against the pier. Young sailors hurried between buildings with their collars turned up against the wind. I remember feeling strangely hollow. Not angry. Not surprised. Just tired. After all those years, my father still believed my service was something shameful, something attention-seeking. I set the phone down carefully. Then I laughed once. A quiet laugh. Because by then I'd spent more than 3 decades making life-and-death decisions under pressure, and somehow a text message from an 80-year-old man still had the power to hurt me more than enemy fire ever had. That evening I nearly decided not to go. I poured myself a glass of bourbon in my Norfolk townhouse and sat alone in the quiet. No husband. No children. That part of my life had slipped away somewhere between deployments and promotions. David, my ex-husband, used to say the Navy always came first. At the time, I denied it. Now I wasn't so sure. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was Ramon Hayes. Master Chief Ramon Hayes. Retired SEAL. One of the best men I'd ever served beside. "Tell me you're still going to Charleston," he said immediately. "How'd you hear about that?" "Claire, half the East Coast defense community's invited to this wedding. Word travels." I sighed. "I'm thinking maybe I should stay home." There was silence on the line for a second. Then Ramon spoke softly. You spent 30 years standing your post for people who never thanked you. Don't start hiding now. That hit harder than I expected. Ramon had seen me during some of the ugliest years of my career. He'd seen me after casualty notifications, after buried friends, after impossible decisions. If he thought I should go, maybe I needed to listen. You really think it matters? I asked. No, he said, I think you matter. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I pulled my full white dress uniform from the garment bag hanging in my closet. Gold buttons polished. Sleeve stripes immaculate. 4 silver stars waiting on the shoulders. I ran my hand across the fabric slowly. People imagine uniforms make you feel powerful. Sometimes they just remind you how much life they cost. By noon, I was driving south toward Charleston in my black sedan with old jazz playing softly through the speakers. The highway stretched endlessly beneath gray Carolina skies. Billboards. Gas stations. Church signs. Tiny southern towns where American flags fluttered outside hardware stores. The kind of places where people still say sir and ma'am. By the time I reached Charleston, evening sunlight had turned the harbor gold. The wedding venue sat along the waterfront like something out of a magazine. White columns, enormous oak trees, strings of lights swaying in the breeze. Valet attendants hurried between luxury cars. Women in pastel dresses laughed beneath champagne tents. And suddenly, at 58 years old, I felt like an unwanted teenager again. I checked into my hotel quietly under my maiden name. The receptionist recognized me from television almost immediately, but was polite enough not to mention it loudly. That night my mother called. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to say she missed me. Just one sentence. Please try not to upset your father tomorrow. I stared at the hotel window overlooking Charleston Harbor after she hung up. Somewhere out there, Navy ships cut through black Atlantic water beneath the dark. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to admit something painful. No matter how many medals sat on my chest. Part of me still wanted my parents to be proud of me. I arrived at the wedding venue early the next afternoon because old military habits die hard. 15 minutes early had been drilled into me since my plebe year at Annapolis. Even after all these years, I still couldn't bring myself to arrive fashionably late like civilians seemed to enjoy doing. The Charleston air was warm and heavy with salt from the harbor. White folding chairs lined the lawn overlooking the water, and a string quartet played softly beneath enormous live oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was beautiful. Melanie always had a talent for beautiful things. Beautiful clothes, beautiful homes, beautiful friendships that looked effortless. Growing up, she could walk into a room and instantly belong there. I always felt like I was studying the room instead. A young valet opened my car door. The moment he saw the 4 stars on my shoulders, his expression changed completely. Good afternoon, ma'am. His posture straightened automatically. I nodded politely and handed him the keys. The reaction wasn't unusual. Military people noticed details civilians overlooked. But the wedding guests gathered outside the venue barely looked at me at all. To them, I was simply an older woman in uniform. Maybe a ceremonial escort. Maybe somebody hired for the event. I carried myself quietly toward the entrance heels, clicking against the stone walkway. Then I saw my mother. Barbara Bennett stood near the reception tent, wearing a pale blue dress and pearls that had belonged to my grandmother. Her smile appeared instantly when she noticed me, but it never quite reached her eyes. "Oh, Claire," she said softly, glancing around nervously, "you really wore it." I looked down at my uniform. "Yes, Mom, I did." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "It's just, this day is supposed to be about Melanie." There it was. Same song, different decade. I kept my tone calm. "I'm attending my sister's wedding respectfully." "Yes, but people might misunderstand." I almost laughed. People misunderstand women in uniform all the time. But before I could answer, my father approached. Harold Bennett still carried himself like the high school football coach he'd once been. Even at 80, he moved with stiff authority, though age had curved his shoulders and softened his hair into thin silver. The moment his eyes landed on my uniform, his jaw tightened. "You actually did it." "Good to see you too, Dad." He ignored that. "You couldn't let Melanie have one day?" I stared at him in disbelief. "I'm standing here quietly." "You know exactly what you're doing," he muttered. That hurt more than I expected. Because the truth was, I had spent my entire adult life trying not to make my family uncomfortable with my success. I changed subjects during holidays, avoided discussing promotions, never corrected them when they minimized my career. And still somehow my existence felt offensive to them. My father leaned closer. You could have worn a normal dress. Normal. I'd heard that word my whole life. Why can't you be normal? Why can't you settle down? Why can't you stop trying to prove something? Before I could respond, Melanie appeared. She looked stunning in her wedding gown. For a moment I saw the little girl who used to follow me around the backyard when we were children. Her expression softened when she hugged me. I'm glad you came. I wouldn't miss it. Then she stepped back and awkwardness returned to her face. Can I ask you something? Of course. She hesitated. Would you maybe consider taking off some of the medals during the reception? I blinked slowly. The medals. They just draw attention. I looked at my little sister standing there in diamonds and lace, still afraid of sharing space with me after all these years. And suddenly I didn't feel angry. Just sad. I earned these, Melanie. I know, she said quickly. I'm not trying to be mean. I know. But she was. Not intentionally, perhaps. Still, the message was clear. Shrink yourself. Again. Before the conversation could continue, wedding guests began arriving in larger groups. Luxury sedans rolled up one after another. Men in tailored suits. Women carrying expensive handbags. Politicians. Business owners. Retired officers. Charleston society. I quietly moved toward the back rows near the water, hoping to avoid further tension. That's when I noticed the first change in atmosphere. A gray-haired man across the lawn froze mid-conversation, staring directly at me. Then another. Whispers began spreading subtly through the crowd. At first I assumed they recognized the uniform itself. High-ranking military dress attire attracts attention, especially in formal settings. But then a retired captain I'd worked with years earlier approached carefully. Admiral Bennett. I smiled politely. Captain Morris, been a long time. Yes, ma'am. The ma'am came instantly, almost reflexively. Nearby guests overheard. Heads began turning. Within minutes, more former service members started recognizing me. Some approached respectfully. Others simply nodded from across the lawn. One older Marine colonel placed his hand over his heart briefly before returning to his seat. I could feel my parents watching all of it uneasily. My father especially. For him, this was unfamiliar territory. At home in Charleston, he was the respected man. The center of attention. The authority. But here among military circles, that authority belonged to me. The ceremony itself began beautifully enough. Sunlight danced across the harbor while vows were exchanged beneath white roses. I stayed quiet in the back row. Clapped politely. Smiled when appropriate. Tried not to think about how emotionally exhausting the afternoon already felt. Afterward, guests moved into the grand ballroom for the reception. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings. Servers carried trays of champagne. A jazz band played old standards near the dance floor. I deliberately chose a small table near the rear corner of the room. Far from the family. Far from attention. Or so I thought. A few minutes later, a young Navy lieutenant approached my table nervously. Excuse me, ma'am. Yes. I just wanted to say it's an honor to meet you. He couldn't have been older than 25. Fresh-faced? Sharp uniform. Probably reminded me of myself once. Thank you, Lieutenant. My father served under you in Afghanistan. That caught me off guard. What's his name? Senior Chief Daniel Mercer. I smiled immediately. Mercer survived because of your evacuation order, the lieutenant said quietly. My family never forgot that. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my chest. Before I could answer, another officer approached. Then another. Across the ballroom, I noticed groups of military guests beginning to notice the gathering around my table. Recognition spread visibly now. A retired SEAL commander near the entrance suddenly stood upright. His eyes widened, and then everything changed. Chairs scraped backward across marble floors, one after another. Then dozens more, until 200 hardened SEALs rose to their feet all at once. The sound hit first. Not voices. Not applause. just the violent scrape of chairs against marble as 200 men rose at the exact same moment. Every instinct inside me immediately recognized military discipline at work. The ballroom froze. Conversations stopped so abruptly that even the jazz band faltered into silence mid-song. I remained seated for half a second, stunned. Then a commander near the ballroom entrance squared his shoulders and bellowed with the kind of authority that once carried across aircraft carrier flight decks. "Admiral on deck." Every military guest snapped to attention. Some civilians stood awkwardly without understanding why. Others simply stared. I slowly rose from my chair. The room became utterly silent. I'd heard that command thousands of times in my life, on ships, at ceremonies, during inspections, in war zones where rank and order meant survival. But hearing it there in my sister's Charleston wedding reception while my parents stood speechless 20 feet away felt surreal. For one strange moment it was as though my two separate lives had collided. The daughter who was never enough, and the admiral who commanded fleets. The commander nearest me held his salute. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." A faint smile tugged at my mouth despite myself. "You always did anyway, Commander." A few quiet laughs rippled through the military crowd, easing the tension slightly. Then I recognized him fully. Commander Nate Holloway. Former SEAL team leader? Last time I'd seen him was overseas nearly 15 years earlier after a disastrous extraction operation in Kandahar. His hair was grayer now, face older. But his eyes carried the same sharp steadiness. "It's good to see you, Admiral Bennett," he said quietly. "You too, Nate." Behind him stood row after row of current and former SEALs officers, chiefs, enlisted sailors, Marines, and defense personnel. Some I recognized immediately. Others had aged enough that I needed a second glance. Yet every face carried the same expression. Respect. Real respect. Not the shallow kind people show powerful individuals because they want something. This was different. This came from shared hardship, shared sacrifice. Across the ballroom, I finally looked toward my parents. My mother's hand covered her mouth. My father stood perfectly still beside her, his face pale beneath the ballroom lights. He looked genuinely confused, as though he couldn't reconcile the daughter he'd spent decades dismissing with the reaction unfolding around him. Melanie looked overwhelmed, more than angry now. The groom Ethan leaned toward her, whispering something urgently while glancing at me with obvious astonishment. Then an older man approached through the crowd. Tall, silver-haired, expensive Navy suit. I recognized him immediately. Thomas Whitaker, former Navy officer turned defense executive worth more money than most small towns. Also Ethan's father. He stopped directly in front of me and extended his hand warmly. "Admiral Bennett," he said, "I had no idea you were Melanie's sister." "That makes two of us," I answered before I could stop myself. To my surprise, Whitaker laughed softly. "Well," he said, "this explains why half the military guests suddenly forgot there's a wedding happening." Even I smiled at that. Whitaker turned toward the room. "For those of you civilians wondering what's happening," he announced calmly, "you're looking at Rear Admiral Claire Bennett, one of the most respected operational leaders this country's produced in the last 20 years. Murmurs spread immediately. I felt my stomach tighten. I never enjoyed public praise. After enough years in leadership, attention becomes exhausting. But there was no stopping it now. A retired SEAL near the back raised his glass. "She brought our boys home." Another voice answered. "Damn right she did." Then another. "Saved my unit in Helmand." A man I barely recognized stepped forward slowly. His left leg carried a noticeable limp. When he spoke, emotion roughened his voice. "You wrote letters to every one of our families after Red River." The room quieted again. I remembered him then. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Dean. We'd lost 4 men during Operation Red River. Worst night of my career. Dean stopped directly in front of me. "You sat with my wife for 6 hours after they told us Tommy didn't make it," he said quietly. "Most commanders send paperwork. You stayed." I swallowed hard. Some memories never loosen their grip. "That's what leaders are supposed to do," I answered softly. "No, ma'am," Dean replied. "That's what good people do." For a moment I couldn't speak. Around us, even civilians seemed moved now. The room no longer felt judgmental. It felt human. And strangely enough, that made everything harder. Because standing there surrounded by all that respect, all I could think about was how badly I'd wanted even a fraction of it from my own family. Whitaker gently motioned toward the head table. "Admiral, would you honor us by joining the family seating?" Before I could answer, my father finally found his voice. "Yes," he said quickly. "Of course she should sit with family." The sudden change almost made me laugh. 2 hours earlier, he'd wanted me invisible. Now he looked desperate to claim me publicly. I walked toward the head table slowly. Guests parted instinctively to make room. Some shook my hand. Others thanked me for my service. One elderly woman touched my arm and whispered, "My grandson made it home because of women like you." I thanked her quietly. When I finally reached the table, my father wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother looked emotional enough to cry. Melanie stared at me carefully. Not with jealousy anymore. Something closer to confusion. As if she'd suddenly realized she never actually knew me. Dinner resumed awkwardly. Conversation slowly returned. But the energy in the ballroom had changed permanently. Now people approached our table constantly. Military officers. Business leaders. Politicians. All wanting to speak with me. My father sat quietly through most of it, listening while strangers described accomplishments he'd never bothered learning about. At one point, an older senator shook my hand firmly. "Your Gulf evacuation strategy saved American lives," he said. "Washington still talks about that operation." My father looked at me sharply. "You planned military evacuations?" I nodded once. "Yes, Dad." He stared down at the tablecloth. A long silence followed. Finally, almost quietly enough to miss, he asked, "Why didn't you ever tell us you were this important?" That question landed harder than any insult ever had. I looked at the man who'd spent 30 years reducing my entire life to works for the government. Then I answered honestly, "You never wanted to know." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my entire life, my father had absolutely nothing to say. After dinner, the reception finally settled back into something resembling a normal wedding. The jazz band resumed playing. Guests drifted toward the dance floor. Servers carried slices of wedding cake between tables, while the Charleston harbor shimmered black beyond the ballroom windows. But everywhere I walked, people kept stopping me. Former sailors, retired Marines, defense contractors, widows of servicemen. Each conversation carried pieces of a life I rarely spoke about outside military circles. A retired chief introduced me to his granddaughter attending Annapolis next year. One former corpsman hugged me so hard I thought my ribs might crack. Another man simply shook my hand silently with tears in his eyes. That one stayed with me. War leaves echoes in people, especially after enough years. Around 9 o'clock, I finally slipped outside for air. The noise of the ballroom faded behind me as I walked toward the marina beside the venue. Charleston Harbor stretched dark and calm beneath the moonlight. Boats rocked gently against wooden docks while warm coastal wind moved through the palmetto trees. For the first time all evening, I could breathe. I leaned against the railing and loosened one white glove slowly. "Mind if I join you, Admiral?" I turned and smiled faintly. Ramon Hayes approached carrying 2 glasses of bourbon. "About time you showed up," I said. "Traffic. That's your excuse for everything." He handed me a glass. Ramon had retired from the SEALs 6 years earlier after multiple surgeries finally forced him out. Even now, he moved carefully, favoring one knee during cold weather. We stood side by side, overlooking the water in comfortable silence. "You handled that circus pretty well," he finally said. "I've survived congressional hearings. Weddings are nothing." He laughed quietly. Then his expression softened. "You okay?" That question nearly broke me. Because underneath the polished uniform and decades of leadership training, part of me still felt emotionally raw from seeing my parents' faces inside that ballroom. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. Ramon nodded like he understood completely. "That's the trouble with family," he said. "Strangers can wound you. Family can convince you the wound belongs there." I stared across the harbor lights. "You know the ridiculous part, I'm 58 years old, and I still wanted my father to look proud of me. That never goes away." "Number?" "Nope." He took a sip of bourbon. "My old man hugged me once in his entire life. I remember the date better than my wedding anniversary. I laughed softly at that. Then footsteps approached behind us. I turned expecting another guest. Instead, it was Melanie. Still in her wedding gown. Still carrying that careful expression people wear when approaching emotional landmines. I hope I'm not interrupting. Ramon immediately stepped back politely. I'll give you ladies a minute. Once he disappeared toward the ballroom, Melanie joined me at the railing. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, she exhaled slowly. I owe you an apology. I remained quiet. When I asked you to remove your medals? She looked down. That was wrong. It wasn't about the medals. No, she admitted, it wasn't. The harbor wind moved loose strands of hair across her face. You know what's awful, she said quietly. I spent most of my life thinking Mom and Dad loved me more because I was somehow better than you. I looked at her carefully. But tonight I realized something. What? They never understood you enough to appreciate you. That hurt because it was true. Melanie's eyes glistened. You were always the brave one, Claire. I almost smiled. You say that now? No, I should have said it years ago. She leaned both hands against the railing beside me. When you left for Annapolis, Mom cried for a week. Dad kept saying you'd fail and come home. I remember. But every promotion you got after that? She shook her head slowly. It scared them. Why? Because you became someone bigger than the life they understood. I looked out toward the dark Atlantic beyond the harbor. Maybe she was right. Small-town Southern families sometimes know how to celebrate familiar success. Marriage. Children. Local respectability. But ambition that carries someone far away can feel threatening. Especially when it changes the family structure itself. Melanie touched my arm gently. For what it's worth, she whispered, I was always proud to tell people my sister was in the Navy. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. Thank you. We stood together quietly after that. For the first time in decades, the competition between us felt gone. Not healed completely, but softened. Then my mother appeared outside the ballroom doors. Her mascara had smudged slightly. She looked smaller somehow. Older. Claire, she said softly, could we talk? Melanie squeezed my hand once before walking away. My mother approached carefully like she feared I might disappear if she moved too quickly. I owe you an apology too, she said immediately. I stayed silent. She looked down at her hands. I didn't understand your life. I think maybe I chose the easier daughter. The honesty stunned me. Melanie needed me differently, she continued. You always seemed so strong. I let out a tired breath. That's the problem with strong daughters, Mom. People think they don't need kindness. Tears filled her eyes instantly. I never meant to hurt you. But you did. I know. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me completely. I used to keep newspaper clippings about your promotions, she admitted quietly. Your father didn't know. I stared at her. What? They're in my dresser drawer at home. That image nearly shattered me. My mother secretly saving pieces of my life while pretending indifference for years. Why do families do this to each other? Why do people who love one another waste so much time withholding it? Before I could answer, another voice spoke behind us. Barbara. My father. He stood near the ballroom doors looking uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. My mother quietly touched my arm and walked back inside, leaving us alone. Dad approached slowly toward the marina railing. The harbor wind moved through his silver hair. For several seconds he simply stared out at the water beside me. Then he spoke without looking at me. I was drafted in 1967. That caught me completely off guard. You never told me that. No, his jaw tightened, because your grandfather made some calls, kept me from serving. I frowned slightly. Dad swallowed hard. I spent my whole life pretending that didn't bother me. And suddenly pieces began fitting together. My father kept staring out across Charleston Harbor like the answer to his entire life might be floating somewhere in the dark water. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then he laughed once. Not happily. More like a man finally exhausted from carrying something too heavy for too long. Your grandfather knew people, he said quietly. Important people, county judges, politicians, men who owed favors. The wind moved softly against the marina docks beneath us. When my draft notice came, he paused. He made sure I never went to Vietnam. I studied him carefully. Growing up, my father had always carried himself like the toughest man in any room, confident, certain, loud when necessary. But standing there now, he looked smaller somehow. Human. I always told people I had a knee problem, he continued. Truth is, I was healthy as a horse. I didn't interrupt. Back then, I convinced myself I was lucky. He swallowed. Then boys I grew up with started coming home in boxes. Pain roughened his voice on the last word. My best friend Tommy Walker died outside Da Nang in '68. We played football together since middle school. He rubbed his hands together slowly. I remember standing at his funeral while everybody called him a hero. His eyes remained fixed on the harbor, and all I could think was, that should have been me over there. The pieces finally clicked together inside my mind. His resentment. His discomfort around military service. His hostility toward my career. It had never truly been about me. It was shame. A lifetime of it. I spent 40 years trying not to think about Vietnam, he admitted quietly. Then my daughter joins the Navy and becomes everything I was too scared to become myself. I let out a slow breath. You could have told me. How he snapped suddenly. How exactly was I supposed to say that? The old temper flashed briefly before fading again. I didn't even know how to admit it to myself. Silence settled between us. Somewhere behind us inside the ballroom, guests laughed while the band played old Frank Sinatra songs. Normal life continuing. Meanwhile, my father stood unraveling decades of buried guilt beside a dark marina. I thought if I minimized your career, he whispered, maybe I wouldn't feel so ashamed of mine. That one hurt. Not because it was cruel. Because it was honest. I leaned both hands against the railing. You know what's strange, Dad?
What?
I spent my entire life thinking you were disappointed in me. He looked at me finally then. Deep regret filled his face. Claire, he said quietly, I never stopped being proud of you. The words hit me so hard I nearly looked away. Because they arrived about 30 years too late. You had a funny way of showing it. I know. He nodded immediately. I know that now. For a moment I saw not the intimidating father from my childhood, but simply an old man carrying regrets he could no longer outrun. Age does that to people. Eventually life strips away enough pride that honesty becomes easier than pretending. Dad cleared his throat roughly. When you left for Annapolis, I told everybody you'd quit after one semester. I smiled faintly. I remember. But every time you proved me wrong, he shook his head slowly, I'd secretly brag about you at work. I blinked. What? Oh, I never told you. He gave a weak laugh. But I kept your newspaper articles in my desk drawer. Emotion caught unexpectedly in my chest. All those years. All those wasted years. I didn't understand your world, he admitted. Truth is, I think it scared me. I stared out at the water again. When I commanded my first destroyer, I said softly, I was terrified every single day for 6 months. Dad looked surprised. You. Yes, me? You never looked scared. That's leadership. A small smile touched his face for the first time all evening. Then he asked quietly, did it cost you a lot, the Navy? That question carried more compassion than anything he'd asked me in years. I thought about David. The miscarriage during deployment. Missed anniversaries. Buried friends. The loneliness of command. Yes, I answered honestly, it cost a lot. Dad nodded slowly like he finally understood something important. You know, he said your mother used to sit by the television during Desert Storm waiting for updates. Pretended she wasn't worried. He smiled faintly, but every time your name came on screen, she'd cry afterward. I looked down at my white gloves resting against the railing. Families are complicated creatures. Sometimes love hides beneath layers of fear, pride, resentment, and misunderstanding, until nobody remembers how to express it properly anymore. Around 10:30, guests began leaving the reception. The music softened. Valets brought cars around front. Inside the ballroom, staff cleared champagne glasses while Melanie and Ethan prepared for their final send-off. Dad shifted awkwardly beside me. I know I can't fix everything tonight. No, I agreed gently, you can't. He nodded once. But I'd like to try. For the first time in decades, I believed him. The next morning I woke before sunrise out of habit. My hotel room overlooked Charleston Harbor, glowing pale gold beneath early morning light. Cargo ships moved slowly across the water while gulls circled above the docks. I dressed quietly in civilian clothes for the drive back to Norfolk. No uniform today. Just jeans, loafers, and a navy sweater. By 7 o'clock I was downstairs checking out when the front desk clerk smiled nervously. "There's someone waiting for you outside, Admiral Bennett." I stepped through the hotel doors, expecting perhaps Ramon. Instead, my father stood beside his old Buick holding a worn cardboard box. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he held the box toward me awkwardly. "Your mother wanted you to have these." I opened it carefully. Inside sat dozens of letters. My letters. Every letter I'd mailed home from Annapolis during my academy years. Some still carried creases from being folded and unfolded repeatedly. My throat tightened instantly. "She kept all of them," I whispered. Dad nodded. "I read them last night." He looked exhausted, older than I'd ever seen him. Then he reached into the box and pulled out one envelope carefully. There was one line. His voice cracked slightly. One line I can't stop thinking about. He handed me the letter. I recognized my own 18-year-old handwriting immediately. Dad swallowed hard. "You wrote..." He paused. "I hope someday Dad will finally be proud of me." Emotion hit both of us at once. His eyes reddened visibly. "I was proud the whole time," he said quietly. "I just didn't know how to say it." I looked at the old man standing before me. And for the first time in my life, I believed him. Melanie arrived a few minutes later carrying coffee and breakfast sandwiches for the drive. She hugged me tightly before I left. "No more disappearing for months at a time," she warned gently. "I'll try." As I pulled onto the highway north, Charleston disappeared slowly behind me beneath soft Carolina morning light. And somewhere between the harbor and the interstate, I realized something unexpected. The greatest victory of my life wasn't becoming an admiral. It was finally understanding I no longer needed anyone's permission to know my own worth. A few hours later, I stopped at a small airport cafe near Norfolk. While waiting for coffee, a nervous young woman in Navy recruit sweats recognized me immediately. Her eyes widened. "Admiral Bennett." I smiled softly. "That's me." The young recruit straightened awkwardly and offered an uncertain salute. I returned it warmly. And suddenly, for the first time in years, the future felt lighter than the past. If this story touched something in your heart, maybe share it with someone who spent too many years feeling unseen. And if you've ever struggled to hear the words, "I'm proud of you," remember this. Sometimes people love us long before they learn how to say it. Thank you for listening.